Alright, so going over some of the types of burns. So there's a couple of types of burns. There's thermal burns, that covers both heat and cold burns. There's chemical burns, which is acidic, which causes coagulative necrosis, and alkali, which causes liquefactive necrosis. We're going to go over that. There's friction burns and there's radiation burns. Now, thermal burns are the most common type you're going to see, and that's what we typically think of when we say a burn. And just the application of heat to the level where there's cell destruction. The heat can be applied from fire, water, oil, steam, anything that can carry heat. It causes coagulation of proteins within tissues, and that causes cell death. And you can see this gentleman here is about to have a meeting with some paramedics very shortly. Now, children get a lot of burns from scalds. So children are very curious, exploratory creatures, and they don't understand that hot things will hurt them. So they see a pot on the stove, they see a cup of coffee up on the bench, they'll very frequently pull it down on themselves. And it causes this characteristic V pattern where there'll be a burn over the face or mouth, and then going from the shoulders, just mirroring the path of the liquid down towards the groin. Very upsetting, very painful for the child. As you can see here, scald burns typically heal quite well, and that's only a shallow dermal, possibly even just an epidermal burn there. Now, cold burns admittedly are quite rare, but they are a type of thermal burn. You'll see them potentially, if you do see them, as a result of liquid nitrogen or probably more commonly dry ice. They tend to be very shallow because people feel the burn, they are painful and pull away quite quickly. When people do have prolonged exposure to sub-zero temperatures, that will cause frostbite, which we'll cover in the weeks to come, which we treat as a separate condition. Now, conversely, we don't cool these burns because they're a cold burn. We actually need to warm them. So if someone has had a contact with liquid nitrogen or dry ice to the point where it's caused skin damage, just warm that affected area in warm water for 20 minutes or so. Now, acids work similarly to thermal burns in the sense that it coagulates proteins, causing cell death. There's often minimal actual heat involved in the reaction. So if we do see someone getting burned by a substance, the first thing we want to do is brush off any powder, any solid contaminants, and then irrigate with water just as you would for a thermal burn until the burning process stops. The aim is to remove the agent, not cool the burn, because there tends not to be that much heat in the burn. Now, some common acids that can cause these burns that you have around the house are hydrochloric acid, which is your toilet and drain cleaner, sulfuric acid in car batteries, and hydrogen peroxide, which is a bleaching agent. Now, these are very dilute acids. A little spill on you is not going to sizzle your skin, but certainly any prolonged contact can cause this sort of damage. Now, alkali are worse than acids. They tend to work slower than acids, so the effects are not picked up on so quickly. And they work in a really insidious way, which is they don't actually coagulate the proteins, they liquefy them. Now, it's not good to get burned, but at least the upside of getting burned with an acid is that if I get burned with an acid on my arm, it coagulates the proteins on my epidermis and dermis, and then that provides a bit of a barrier for the underlying tissues from the acid. Alkali will liquefy that skin, which then leaves more skin underneath for it to liquefy as well, and it will just, if it's unchecked, it will just continue to slowly liquefy its way down. So until that chemical is actually removed, it will just continue to do damage. So again, the same process as before. We want to brush off any solid contaminants we can see, and then irrigate with water. For alkali, really want to go to town on it. So more than half an hour is typical. You can find case studies of people requiring up to 2 hours of irrigation before that process was completely stopped on their skin. So some alkali that we might see are lime, which is calcium oxide, which is used in agriculture, particularly if you do get a job in North Queensland. They use lime at the sugar mills. And every now and then we'll have some sort of explosion there and lime contamination. Sodium hypochlorite is another bleaching agent which you may have in your house, and sodium hydroxide is the basis for oven cleaner. Again, these are fairly dilute, but you don't want to have them on your skin for a long period of time. All right, friction burns. So we're going to get this from the road, from treadmill injuries, trampolines. It's just the abrasion of skin which causes direct damage and you don't grow a second head. That's a typo. Causes heat generation. We've all had grazes and abrasions. Very rarely causes any sort of significant damage. Treatment's generally just first aid. Now, sunburn and windburn, which is also just sunburn, is a type of radiation burn. So UV light from the sun destroys your DNA, damages your DNA, and that causes inflammation. So if you get a lot of UV light, say across your neck or back, if you haven't put your sun cream on, like this gentleman, you get a lot of DNA damage in those cells, and you have this big inflammatory reaction. Very painful. We've all had painful sunburns. Generally not a problem. They just need mild pain relief, maybe some soothing creams. There are some rare cases where people get such a large burn, just like we covered in the last lecture. They get a systemic response of these inflammatory mediators, and they can actually require hospitalization for some hemodynamic support. And finally, another type of radiation burn is flash burn, also called welder's burn. And this is just a sunburn on your eye, on your cornea. So it's, the typical injury is from welding. You've got that very bright, high UV light. That's why welders wear these masks with these very dark tinted eyeglasses to keep their eyes safe. But it's also why your mum told you not to look at the sun, is if you do look at the sun for too long, you can end up with a flash burn. It's very painful. Causes bloodshot, irritated eyes, but typically self-resolves.